"You don't belong anywhere near this table," the billionaire said without even looking up from his phone, and for one suspended heartbeat, every clink of crystal, every soft note from the jazz trio, and every quiet conversation inside Manhattan's most exclusive rooftop restaurant seemed to dissolve into silence. The words drifted across the room with the effortless confidence of a man who had spent 20 years believing money could define every person's worth. Ethan Walker, 42, founder and CEO of Walker Dynamics, sat beneath warm amber lights overlooking the glittering skyline, wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit that reflected the city's golden glow. Forbes called him one of America's most influential innovators. Investors admired him. Competitors feared him. Employees respected him from a careful distance. Tonight, however, none of those titles mattered as much as the impatient expression crossing his face when a young waitress paused beside his table carrying a polished silver tray. Naomi Brooks offered the same calm smile she gave every guest. 25 years old, confident without arrogance, graceful without trying to impress anyone, she adjusted a glass that had drifted slightly too close to the edge of the linen tablecloth. "Excuse me, sir," she said gently. "I just wanted to make sure nothing spills." Ethan barely acknowledged her. "I've managed billion-dollar negotiations," he replied, his voice cool enough for nearby executives to hear. "I think I can manage a dinner plate." A few restrained laughs circled the table. Naomi simply nodded. "Of course, sir." She stepped back without another word. She had learned years ago that dignity often sounded quieter than pride. Around her, servers continued moving between candlelit tables while panoramic windows reflected the shimmering Hudson River below. Expensive watches flashed beneath tailored sleeves. Venture capitalists discussed artificial intelligence, mergers, and market forecasts over Wagyu steaks and vintage Napa Cabernet. It was the kind of evening where everyone seemed eager to prove they belonged. Naomi belonged too, just not in the way anyone assumed. Few people noticed how carefully she watched every entrance, every hallway, every unfamiliar face entering the restaurant. Years of working luxury events had taught her that wealth attracted attention from more than admirers. Sometimes instinct noticed what cameras missed. Tonight, that instinct refused to settle. Near the elevator lobby, a man wearing an expensive charcoal jacket glanced toward Ethan's private dining room for just a second too long before quietly disappearing around a corner. Another guest entered moments later, speaking into a wireless earpiece before pretending to answer a text message. Nothing looked alarming, yet something felt wrong. Naomi reminded herself not to jump to conclusions. She had been wrong before, and assumptions could cost someone a job. Still, she couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling tightening in her chest. Meanwhile, Ethan continued entertaining potential partners, negotiating a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure project that could reshape energy technology across the country. Every word at his table carried the weight of fortunes. Every signature expected later that evening could change thousands of lives. Ironically, the one person paying the closest attention wasn't seated among the executives. It was the woman quietly refilling water glasses. She noticed the exits. She noticed unfamiliar patterns. She noticed people who looked everywhere except at the food they supposedly came to enjoy. Most importantly, she noticed that no one was paying attention to them. Ethan certainly wasn't. His confidence had become a shield so polished that it reflected only his own certainty. He never imagined the quiet waitress he had dismissed less than 5 minutes earlier would soon become the reason he saw another sunrise. And Naomi never imagined that before the night ended, one impossible decision would quietly tie her future to the most powerful man she had ever served. Some stories begin with applause. Others begin with arrogance. The unforgettable ones begin when someone invisible quietly decides another person's life is worth protecting, even if that person never learns their name. Before we continue, if you enjoy unforgettable stories about ordinary people facing extraordinary moments, subscribe to Hidden Tables. Every story reminds us that true character is revealed through courage, compassion, and the choices we make when no one is watching. Now, let's see what happens next. Naomi carried another tray toward the private dining room, but her attention stayed fixed on the reflections dancing across the floor-to-ceiling windows rather than the expensive glassware balanced effortlessly in her hands. Experience had taught her that people often revealed more when they believed no one important was watching. The two unfamiliar men she had noticed earlier were no longer standing near the elevator. One had quietly relocated to the cocktail lounge, overlooking the entrance, while the other casually examined artwork in a hallway where no guests normally lingered. Neither ordered food. Neither spoke with the staff. Yet both seemed unusually interested whenever Ethan Walker or his business partners appeared within sight. Naomi slowed just enough to memorize their faces before continuing toward table 12 with the same warm smile every guest expected. She refused to let suspicion become panic. Luxury restaurants attracted all kinds of visitors, and making assumptions could unfairly accuse innocent people. Still, the uneasy feeling refused to leave. Inside the private dining room, the negotiations had become more relaxed. Laughter replaced formal presentations as servers delivered dessert and freshly brewed coffee. Ethan leaned back comfortably, discussing expansion plans that stretched from New York to Dallas, Seattle, and Silicon Valley. Every sentence carried confidence. Every answer sounded rehearsed by years of success. When Naomi refilled his water glass, he barely acknowledged her presence. One executive politely thanked her, but Ethan remained focused on the conversation unfolding around polished walnut tables and glowing city lights. To him, she was simply another employee blending into the background. Naomi quietly stepped away, but before reaching the service station, she noticed one of the unfamiliar men glance toward his wristwatch, then exchange an almost invisible nod with someone standing outside the dining room entrance. It lasted less than a second. Most people would never have noticed. Naomi did. Her heartbeat quickened. She walked into the kitchen where stainless steel counters reflected bright overhead lights and chefs moved with practiced precision. The restaurant manager was reviewing inventory reports near the office door. Naomi approached carefully. "Excuse me, Daniel," she said in a calm voice. "Have we hired additional security for tonight?" Daniel looked up with mild confusion. "No." "What?" Naomi hesitated. "There are two guests who seem more interested in watching one table than enjoying dinner." Daniel offered a reassuring smile. "High-profile clients attract curious people all the time. As long as they are not disturbing anyone, there is nothing we can do." Naomi nodded respectfully, although the answer did little to ease her concern. She returned to the dining room carrying fresh espresso cups, determined to remain observant without alarming anyone. Outside, rain began tapping gently against the windows, softening the brilliant city lights into shimmering streaks across the glass. Inside, the atmosphere remained elegant, almost peaceful. Yet beneath that polished calm, Naomi sensed invisible pieces slowly moving into place like a chess match only she seemed to notice. As Ethan's meeting finally approached its conclusion, several executives prepared to leave through the private elevator reserved for VIP guests. Ethan gathered a leather portfolio containing documents worth billions of dollars in future investments. He checked a message on his phone and stood, thanking everyone for attending before heading toward the quieter hallway leading to the executive exit. Naomi watched him disappear around the corner. Something inside her whispered that he should not be walking there alone. She could not explain why. She only knew that every instinct she had learned through years of quietly observing people was urging her to follow, even if no one else believed there was any reason to worry. Naomi placed the untouched espresso cups onto a service station and quietly removed the white towel folded over her arm. Something about the hallway ahead felt different now. The elegant rhythm of the restaurant continued uninterrupted behind her as soft conversations blended with gentle piano music, yet the corridor leading toward the executive elevator had become strangely still. She did not run. She did not call attention to herself. Instead, she walked with the same measured pace expected from a professional server, knowing that confidence often attracted less attention than fear. Ahead, Ethan Walker was reviewing a message on his phone while one of his assistants spoke briefly with the concierge near the private exit. Rain streaked across the tall windows, blurring the city lights into ribbons of gold and silver. As Naomi approached the corner, she noticed the two unfamiliar men subtly changing positions once again. One stepped toward the elevator as though waiting for it to arrive. The other paused beside a decorative sculpture, pretending to admire the artwork while carefully watching Ethan's movements through the reflection in the polished metal. Neither action violated any rule. Together, however, they formed a pattern that refused to feel accidental. Naomi slowed for only a heartbeat before making a decision that would seem insignificant to everyone except herself. She approached Ethan with complete professionalism and spoke just loudly enough for him to hear. "Excuse me, sir. I believe the restaurant manager asked me to let you know there may be a brief delay with the executive elevator because of a maintenance inspection. Would you mind waiting 1 minute while I confirm?" Ethan looked up with visible irritation. "Another delay?" he asked. "I have a car waiting downstairs." Naomi remained composed. "I understand, sir. I only wanted to make sure your evening stays convenient." Ethan sighed impatiently but stopped walking. His assistant glanced toward the elevator doors, then checked his watch. The pause lasted less than 60 seconds. Yet during that brief moment, the elevator doors opened unexpectedly before immediately closing again without anyone stepping out. One of the unfamiliar men frowned almost imperceptibly before walking away toward the lobby as though nothing unusual had happened. The second disappeared through another hallway without speaking a single word. Naomi watched both reflections fade into the distance. The uneasy pressure inside her chest slowly eased. Whatever sequence she had sensed had quietly dissolved before it ever unfolded. A maintenance employee appeared moments later pushing a cart filled with inspection equipment. He apologized for a temporary electrical warning that had interrupted the elevator system for less than a minute before confirming everything was operating normally. Ethan's assistant thanked him, seemingly relieved by the explanation. Ethan simply shook his head. "New York," he muttered with a faint smile. "Even luxury buildings cannot escape inconvenient timing." He stepped into the elevator with his team and disappeared toward the lobby, never realizing how narrowly an uncertain chain of events had shifted course. Naomi remained standing in the hallway for another moment before returning to her duties. She questioned herself almost immediately. Had she imagined the danger? Had instinct simply exaggerated ordinary coincidences? She had no evidence proving anything had truly been wrong. Even if she explained her concerns, no one would believe that a waitress had altered the direction of an evening with nothing more than quiet observation and a polite request to wait. By the time her shift ended after midnight, the restaurant had returned to its familiar calm. Chairs were neatly arranged. Candles were extinguished one by one. Rain had stopped, leaving the streets glistening beneath the city lights. Naomi folded her apron, thanked her co-workers, and stepped outside into the cool Manhattan air, believing the night was finally over. She never imagined that somewhere across the city, security teams were already beginning to ask why a sequence of carefully planned events had suddenly failed without anyone understanding the simple, unnoticed reason why. The following morning arrived with headlines celebrating another successful evening for one of the country's most recognizable business leaders, while the quiet moments that had unfolded beyond the dining room remained invisible to everyone except the few people who had unknowingly witnessed fragments of them. Ethan Walker walked into the headquarters of Walker Dynamics exactly as he did every weekday, surrounded by assistants, advisors, and a calendar filled from sunrise until late evening. The interruption at the restaurant had already become nothing more than an amusing inconvenience in his mind. He joked briefly about elevators choosing the worst possible moments to require maintenance before moving directly into meetings that would influence contracts across several states. His confidence remained untouched because, from his perspective, nothing important had happened. Across Manhattan, Naomi Brooks returned to the restaurant for another shift, carrying the same calm professionalism she brought every day. She never mentioned the uneasy feeling she had experienced the night before. She never told coworkers about the unfamiliar men, the strange timing, or the decision that had persuaded one impatient guest to pause for less than a minute. Without proof, the story sounded like imagination rather than judgment. She believed the responsible choice was to keep serving guests instead of searching for attention. Sometimes the kindest actions disappeared the moment they were completed, and she had made peace with that long ago. Late that afternoon, however, events began moving in directions neither of them expected. Walker Dynamics received a discreet visit from a private security consulting firm that had been reviewing unusual activity connected to several high-profile executives throughout the city. The investigators requested surveillance recordings from businesses surrounding the restaurant district as part of a routine assessment. Ethan listened politely but dismissed the conversation as an abundance of caution. His company handled sensitive negotiations every week, and additional security reviews rarely produced meaningful discoveries. Even so, the firm's analysts continued gathering digital records from nearby buildings, parking garages, and traffic cameras. Unfortunately, one critical source of information no longer existed. During the brief electrical interruption that had affected the executive elevator, the restaurant's hallway surveillance system had automatically restarted. The recording covering those crucial moments was incomplete, leaving only scattered images before and after the interruption. There was no clear explanation for the unfamiliar visitors, no continuous timeline, and certainly no evidence showing why Ethan had paused before reaching the elevator. The missing minute quietly erased the simplest path to understanding the night's events. Days turned into weeks. The investigation gradually lost momentum because every clue seemed to end where certainty should have begun. The unidentified visitors had paid cash, provided temporary contact information, and vanished back into the rhythm of a city where millions of strangers crossed paths every day. Without stronger evidence, the matter became another unfinished file resting inside secure archives. Ethan eventually stopped thinking about it altogether. Naomi did the same, although every so often she found herself remembering the expressions reflected in polished glass and wondering whether instinct alone had truly changed anything. She reminded herself that life often offered no immediate answers. Not every good decision came with recognition. Not every quiet act of courage received applause. Some choices simply became invisible foundations beneath futures that would never know how close they had come to unfolding differently. Neither Ethan nor Naomi realized that the unanswered questions from that rainy Manhattan evening had not disappeared. They had merely been waiting. Time has a remarkable habit of protecting certain truths until the people who need them most are finally ready to understand what they once overlooked, and somewhere beyond both of their ordinary routines, the first small pieces of that hidden truth were already beginning to move into place. 3 months slipped quietly into history, carrying that rainy Manhattan evening farther away with every sunrise until it became little more than an unfinished memory buried beneath the weight of ordinary life. Walker Dynamics expanded into new markets, announced ambitious partnerships, and attracted even greater attention from investors across the country. Ethan Walker remained exactly who the world expected him to be, decisive in the boardroom, admired on magazine covers, and relentlessly focused on building an empire that seemed impossible to slow. His calendar left almost no room for reflection. Every hour belonged to negotiations, strategy sessions, shareholder meetings, and flights between New York, Chicago, Dallas, and San Francisco. The unanswered questions surrounding that strange night had quietly faded behind more immediate priorities. Whenever someone mentioned increased executive security, Ethan simply approved another report without reading every detail. From his perspective, the future always mattered more than the past. Naomi Brooks lived a very different rhythm. Every afternoon, she tied the familiar red apron around her waist, greeted coworkers with the same genuine smile, and welcomed guests whose names she often remembered long before they remembered hers. She never expected recognition for doing the right thing. Her satisfaction came from knowing she had acted according to her conscience, whether anyone noticed or not. Yet there was another side of Naomi's life that almost no one inside the restaurant had ever seen. After finishing late shifts, she spent several hours each night studying industry reports, financial statements, logistics journals, and technology publications inside a quiet public library that remained open well past dinner. The librarians recognized her by name. They often smiled as she carried stacks of business books to the same corner table beneath a tall window overlooking the street. To strangers, she looked like an ambitious student preparing for graduate school. In truth, she simply refused to let knowledge become something reserved only for people with expensive offices. She believed wisdom belonged to anyone willing to earn it through discipline. One evening, while reviewing an article discussing supply chain innovation, Naomi noticed a familiar company logo printed across the top of the page. Walker Dynamics had just announced a historic infrastructure initiative valued at nearly $4 billion. Financial commentators praised the project's scale, calling it one of the boldest corporate investments of the decade. Naomi read every publicly available detail with quiet curiosity. The proposal was impressive, Yet something about one section immediately caught her attention. A projected distribution model depended upon assumptions that appeared unusually optimistic compared with current transportation capacity across several regions. She read the figures again, then a third time, carefully comparing published numbers against publicly available infrastructure reports. The more she studied, the more uncomfortable she became. She reminded herself that she possessed only public information while the company's executives undoubtedly had access to confidential data unavailable to outsiders. Even so, the pattern continued bothering her. Meanwhile, inside the glass headquarters of Walker Dynamics, celebration filled the executive floor. Analysts predicted record growth, investors applauded the announcement, and senior leadership prepared presentations describing a future that appeared almost guaranteed. Confidence echoed through every conference room. Few people questioned assumptions because success had become familiar. Yet history often whispers its warnings before it ever raises its voice. Naomi closed the final report shortly before midnight and stared through the library window at the city lights reflecting across rain-soaked sidewalks. She had no authority, no prestigious title, and certainly no invitation to question decisions made by one of the country's most respected corporations. Still, the same quiet instinct that had once persuaded her to delay a man for less than a minute now urged her not to ignore what she had discovered. She did not yet know whether she was seeing an ordinary misunderstanding or the first small crack in a project that carried the hopes of thousands of employees. She only knew that sometimes the greatest responsibility begins with a single unanswered question that everyone else has been too busy to ask. The question followed Naomi through every shift, every subway ride home, and every quiet hour beneath the warm lights of the public library. Was she seeing a harmless difference in public projections, or was she looking at the beginning of a mistake large enough to affect thousands of families whose livelihoods depended on Walker Dynamics? She refused to let pride answer for her. Instead, she gathered publicly available transportation reports, port capacity studies, manufacturing forecasts, and federal infrastructure updates, carefully comparing each source against the company's published timeline. Every new document seemed to point toward the same conclusion. The expansion itself was visionary. The execution schedule was dangerously optimistic. If even one critical transportation corridor experienced moderate delays, inventory would arrive weeks behind schedule, creating a chain reaction that could increase costs far beyond the original projections. Naomi closed another report and leaned back quietly. She had no confidential information. She had broken no rules. Everything she examined had been released through public filings and industry publications. Even so, connecting those pieces required patience that many people simply did not have time to invest. Across the city, the atmosphere inside Walker Dynamics had begun to shift almost imperceptibly. The executive team celebrated early commitments from investors, yet operations managers were quietly reporting small inconsistencies between supplier estimates and regional shipping forecasts. Individually, each concern appeared manageable. Together, however, they formed a pattern that few people recognized because every department viewed only its own portion of the project. Ethan Walker listened carefully during executive briefings, but confidence still outweighed caution. His leadership had been rewarded countless times for moving faster than competitors. Delaying a project of this scale without undeniable evidence could cost both momentum and credibility. "We stay on schedule," Ethan said calmly during one strategy meeting. "If new information appears, we adjust. Until then, we execute." Around the conference table, heads nodded in agreement. Success has a quiet way of convincing intelligent people that yesterday's instincts will always solve tomorrow's problems. That same evening, Naomi returned to the restaurant where another elegant dinner service unfolded beneath crystal chandeliers and panoramic views of Manhattan. Guests discussed stock markets, technology, politics, and vacation homes while servers moved gracefully between tables. During a short break, Naomi opened her notebook once more. She had organized pages of handwritten calculations, arrows connecting logistics hubs, estimated freight capacities, seasonal weather patterns, and manufacturing timelines. It looked less like the notebook of a waitress and more like the working journal of a senior operations analyst. A fellow server glanced at the pages and smiled. "You always study after work," she said. Are you planning to become an executive someday? Naomi smiled back softly. I'm just trying to understand how complicated problems fit together. Her coworker laughed warmly before returning to the dining room, never realizing how accurate that answer truly was. Naomi stared at the final page of notes. She could ignore everything she had found and continue living exactly as she had before. No one would criticize her for remaining silent. After all, Walker Dynamics employed some of the brightest business minds in America. Who would ever believe that a restaurant waitress might notice something they had overlooked? Yet another thought refused to leave her. If she stayed silent and the project failed exactly as she feared, would she spend years wondering whether one respectful message might have changed the outcome? She remembered another evening only months earlier when instinct had encouraged her to speak despite having no guarantee she was right. That decision had cost her nothing except a few uncomfortable seconds. This one felt much heavier. As midnight settled over the city, Naomi carefully organized her research into a clear summary supported entirely by public information. She did not accuse anyone of making mistakes. She did not claim to know more than experienced executives. She simply outlined several questions and possible risks that deserved another look before irreversible decisions were made. Then she closed the folder, took a slow breath, and realized that sometimes the greatest courage does not come from proving someone wrong. Sometimes it begins with respectfully asking whether everyone has looked at the same facts closely enough. Naomi spent the next 2 evenings reviewing every page one final time before convincing herself that sending anything at all was still the right decision. She removed every sentence that sounded emotional, every opinion that could not be supported by publicly available information, and every conclusion that reached beyond the facts. What remained was not a criticism of Walker Dynamics, but a carefully organized analysis prepared with remarkable discipline. It contained shipping projections from federal transportation reports, publicly disclosed supplier schedules, regional freight capacity estimates, and several questions explaining how a single delay at one distribution hub could ripple through the entire expansion timeline. She signed nothing more than her name, included her personal email address, and submitted the document through the company's public corporate contact portal under the category labeled Business Suggestions. Then she closed her laptop and returned to preparing for another dinner shift, believing there was almost no chance anyone would ever read it. Several days later, inside the headquarters of Walker Dynamics, hundreds of electronic messages continued flowing into corporate inboxes as they did every week. Marketing proposals, investor inquiries, vendor requests, promotional offers, and unsolicited business advice filled the system faster than employees could review them. Naomi's document landed inside a shared mailbox assigned to a junior administrative coordinator responsible for sorting incoming correspondence. The subject line appeared ordinary. The sender was unknown. The attachment came from someone whose occupation was not listed beside an impressive title or recognizable organization. After scanning the opening paragraph, the coordinator quietly categorized it as unsolicited external commentary and forwarded it into a digital folder reserved for general suggestions that rarely reach senior leadership. It was not dismissed with disrespect. It was simply buried beneath thousands of similar messages competing for attention. Naomi never received a reply, and she had expected exactly that. She reminded herself that doing the right thing did not guarantee recognition. Across the city, Walker Dynamics continued moving confidently toward the largest implementation phase of its $4 billion initiative. New supplier agreements were finalized. Construction schedules accelerated. Investors praised the company's decisive leadership during quarterly earnings presentations. Television commentators described Ethan Walker as the executive willing to move boldly while competitors hesitated. Every public signal pointed toward another extraordinary success. Yet beneath the celebration, small inconsistencies continued appearing inside operational reports. Shipping estimates from one region differed slightly from warehouse readiness in another. Manufacturing timelines drifted by only a few days before correcting themselves again. No individual discrepancy justified alarm, but together they formed a pattern still hidden beneath the overwhelming momentum of the project. Ethan noticed several questions raised during executive briefings, yet each department assured him adjustments were already underway. Experience had taught him that large projects always produce temporary complications before finding their rhythm. There was no reason, at least not yet, to doubt years of planning by experienced professionals. Meanwhile, Naomi quietly accepted that her responsibility had ended the moment she sent the report. She never attempted to contact the company again. She never searched for executives on social media. She never told coworkers what she had done. The notebook filled with calculations returned to the shelf beside her growing collection of business journals and logistics studies. She believed knowledge carried its greatest value when offered with humility rather than pride. If someone eventually found her observations useful, that would be enough. If no one ever saw them, she could still live peacefully knowing she had chosen responsibility over silence. Sometimes history changes because powerful people make extraordinary decisions. Sometimes it changes because someone with no influence at all quietly refuses to ignore a question that everyone else overlooks. Naomi did not know it, but somewhere inside the digital archives of Walker Dynamics, her forgotten report was waiting patiently for the exact moment when ordinary assumptions would no longer be enough. And when that moment finally arrived, one overlooked waitress would become impossible to overlook. Before we continue, if you enjoy stories where the most overlooked people reveal the greatest strength, subscribe to Hidden Tables. Here, every story reminds us that courage, integrity, and kindness can come from the most unexpected places. Now, let's see what happened next. The first signs of trouble arrived so quietly that almost nobody recognized them as warnings. A shipment scheduled to leave a major distribution hub remained delayed by only 48 hours because of unexpected rail congestion. Another supplier reported a temporary equipment upgrade that postponed production by 3 days. A coastal logistics partner requested minor scheduling adjustments after severe seasonal weather slowed port operations farther south. Individually, each report appeared ordinary. Together, they began pulling invisible threads that connected every stage of Walker Dynamics' ambitious expansion. Inside the Executive Operations Center, digital dashboards still glowed green across most categories, yet several managers exchanged increasingly thoughtful looks during the morning briefing. Ethan Walker listened as department leaders described contingency plans already in progress. Every explanation sounded reasonable. Every delay appeared manageable. Still, the confidence that had filled the conference room only weeks earlier carried a different tone now. It was no longer effortless. It required reassurance. "Keep monitoring every variable," Ethan said calmly. "If adjustments are necessary, we make them before they become problems." His leadership team agreed, and the meeting moved forward. Nobody realized that the pattern unfolding before them had already been outlined weeks earlier inside a forgotten document resting unnoticed within the company's electronic archives. Later that afternoon, a senior operations analyst named Rebecca Collins began reviewing historical correspondence while searching for outside industry observations related to freight capacity. She believed useful ideas sometimes appeared from unexpected places, especially during complicated projects. Most messages offered little beyond broad opinions or sales pitches, but one attachment immediately caught her attention because of its unusual structure. It contained no dramatic claims, no emotional language, and no attempt to impress anyone. Instead, each concern was supported by public reports, transportation statistics, supplier timelines, and carefully organized questions. Rebecca slowed her reading. The similarities between the document and the issues now emerging across multiple departments were impossible to ignore. She highlighted several pages before walking directly toward her director's office. "You should look at this," she said quietly. "I do not know who wrote it, but whoever they are noticed this pattern weeks before we did." Her director accepted the printed pages with polite curiosity. 10 minutes later, curiosity had become focused attention. By the end of the hour, copies were circulating among several members of the operations team. No one commented on the author's occupation because no occupation had been listed. They discussed only the quality of the reasoning. Every recommendation remained practical. Every concern matched publicly available evidence. Most remarkably, the proposed adjustments offered realistic alternatives rather than criticism. Rebecca searched the submission record and discovered only a name and an email address. Naomi Brooks. Nothing more. No corporate title. No consulting firm. No university affiliation. Just a person who had quietly offered thoughtful analysis without asking for recognition. Across the city, Naomi continued serving dinner beneath warm restaurant lights. completely unaware that her forgotten report had finally reached the people capable of understanding it. She greeted families celebrating birthdays, refilled coffee cups for elderly couples, and smiled warmly at travelers visiting New York for the first time. To every guest, she remained exactly what they expected to see, a professional waitress performing her job with quiet excellence. They could not see the hours she had invested studying logistics after midnight or the discipline hidden behind her calm demeanor. Back inside Walker Dynamics, Rebecca compared Naomi's recommendations against the newest operational reports. One by one, projected risks aligned with developing realities. Small schedule revisions based on the report could prevent much larger disruptions weeks later. The discovery spread cautiously through senior management, not because they fully understood who Naomi was, but because they suddenly realized someone outside the company had recognized the emerging pattern long before experienced insiders had connected all the pieces. Without intending to, an overlooked waitress had just become one of the most important voices in a $4 billion conversation, and the people reading her work had no idea that the same quiet judgment had already changed Ethan Walker's life once before. Rebecca Collins waited until the next executive operations meeting before placing Naomi Brooks's report on the polished conference table. No dramatic introduction, no exaggerated claims. She simply opened the first page and said, "Before we finalize the revised logistics schedule, I believe everyone should read this." Around the room, senior managers skimmed the document with polite curiosity that gradually transformed into focused concentration. The analysis did not rely on privileged information or inside contacts. Every observation had been assembled from public transportation reports, supplier announcements, infrastructure forecasts, and carefully reasoned comparisons. The recommendations were practical, measured, and remarkably consistent with the operational concerns that had only recently begun surfacing across multiple departments. Ethan Walker remained silent longer than usual as he turned each page. The author never claimed certainty. Instead, every paragraph invited careful verification. There was no arrogance, no attempt to impress, only disciplined thinking supported by facts. "Who prepared this?" Ethan finally asked. Rebecca glanced at the submission record displayed on the conference room screen. "The report came through our public business suggestion portal several weeks ago," she replied. It was initially categorized with general correspondence because the sender had no corporate affiliation. Ethan nodded slowly. "Name: Naomi Brooks." The room remained quiet. One executive searched the internal employee directory. Nothing appeared. Another assumed she represented a consulting firm whose information had been omitted. Rebecca shook her head. "There is no company listed, no professional title, only an email address." Ethan looked back at the report. Something about the writing felt strangely familiar. Not the subject itself, but the discipline behind it. Whoever Naomi Brooks was, she had noticed weak signals before experienced professionals connected them together. That required unusual patience and uncommon judgment. He closed the folder gently instead of sliding it aside with the other meeting materials. "Verify every recommendation," he said calmly. "If the supporting data checks out, we implement the adjustments immediately." During the following 48 hours, operations teams compared Naomi's analysis against updated supplier reports, regional freight projections, and revised manufacturing schedules. The results surprised everyone involved. Several proposed schedule changes reduced projected delays before they could spread through the larger network. Alternate routing suggestions improved flexibility without increasing overall costs. Even more impressive, Naomi had identified the precise sequence in which seemingly minor disruptions could combine into a much larger operational challenge weeks later. By acting early, Walker Dynamics avoided expensive revisions that analysts later estimated could have affected hundreds of millions of dollars in scheduling efficiency. The atmosphere inside headquarters changed almost overnight. Conversations no longer centered only on solving the immediate challenge. They also focused on discovering the identity of the person who had recognized the pattern first. Ethan instructed Rebecca to contact Naomi and invite her for a professional conversation, emphasizing that there was no obligation and no expectation beyond thanking her personally for sharing thoughtful work. Rebecca opened the original submission record, prepared to send an email, then paused. Attached to the archived message was another document generated automatically by the company's correspondence system. It recorded the exact date Naomi had submitted her report. Rebecca stared at the timestamp for several seconds before quietly opening another internal file. Months earlier, corporate security had documented an unusual evening following Ethan's private dinner meeting in Manhattan. The dates matched exactly. Rebecca frowned thoughtfully. It was probably nothing more than coincidence. Still, curiosity persuaded her to review the older security summary before sending the invitation. Hidden among routine notes was one small sentence describing an unidentified restaurant employee who had briefly delayed Ethan's departure because of what had been described as a possible elevator maintenance concern. No name had ever been recorded. Rebecca looked from the security file back to Naomi's report, then at the identical date appearing on both records. For the first time, two completely unrelated stories began to overlap, and somewhere beyond coincidence, the forgotten details of one rainy evening were quietly beginning to reveal a truth that none of them had imagined. Rebecca did not believe in coincidences, especially when two independent records pointed toward the same person. Instead of sending the invitation immediately, she walked to the corporate security office carrying both files beneath her arm. The senior security director listened patiently as she explained why an overlooked business proposal and an unfinished incident report appeared connected by nothing more than a date and one missing name. He opened the archived case from the rainy evening months earlier and reviewed every available detail once again. The hallway surveillance recording still contained an unexplained gap during the brief electrical interruption. Witness statements remained limited because no one had recognized anything unusual at the time. One restaurant employee had reportedly asked Ethan Walker to wait briefly because of what she believed was an elevator maintenance issue. Less than 1 minute later, two unidentified visitors unexpectedly left the area before the elevator resumed normal operation. At the time, investigators could not determine whether the sequence carried any real significance. Looking back with months of perspective, however, the unanswered questions suddenly felt much larger. The security director contacted the restaurant manager, Daniel, who still remembered the evening surprisingly well. "Yes," he replied after a thoughtful pause. "One of my servers asked whether we had hired additional security because she noticed two guests behaving strangely. I told her everything was probably fine. Later, she politely delayed Mr. Walker for less than a minute while maintenance checked the elevator." Rebecca took a slow breath. "Do you remember the server's name?" Daniel answered almost immediately. "Naomi Brooks." Silence settled over the office. The final missing piece had quietly fallen into place. Rebecca looked through the conference room window toward the Manhattan skyline, realizing that the woman whose careful analysis had just helped protect a $4 billion initiative was also the same person whose quiet judgment might have prevented a far more serious situation months earlier. She had never requested recognition for either action. She had simply done what she believed was right and continued living her ordinary life. Later that afternoon, Rebecca entered Ethan Walker's office carrying a thin folder instead of the usual stack of reports. Ethan noticed her expression before she spoke. "Something changed," he said. Rebecca nodded and placed both files on his desk. "I believe we finally know who submitted the logistics analysis." Ethan smiled slightly. "Good. I would like to thank her personally." Rebecca remained standing. "There is something else you should see first." She carefully explained the connection between the archived security investigation and the forgotten restaurant incident. Ethan listened without interrupting. As each detail unfolded, his confident expression slowly gave way to thoughtful disbelief. He remembered dismissing the waitress who had interrupted his walk toward the elevator. He remembered assuming she had delayed him because of routine restaurant confusion. He had never considered that she might have been responding to something she alone had noticed. "Are you telling me," he asked quietly, "that the woman whose report helped us avoid this operational crisis is also the waitress from that night?" Rebecca nodded. Every record now points to the same conclusion. Ethan leaned back in silence. The room suddenly felt much quieter than before. His memory returned with unexpected clarity. The calm voice asking him to wait. The brief irritation he had felt. The maintenance employee arriving moments later. The elevator delay that had seemed meaningless. Then another realization settled over him with equal force. Naomi Brooks had never contacted the media. She had never asked for a reward. She had never mentioned the restaurant, the security investigation, or even her earlier encounter when she submitted her business analysis. She had allowed both actions to remain anonymous. For the first time in many years, Ethan found himself wondering how many extraordinary people he had failed to notice simply because they carried no impressive title, and he quietly understood that the most important meeting on his calendar was no longer with investors, directors, or executives. It was with the waitress he had barely acknowledged, whose character had already changed the future of his company long before he ever learned her name. Rebecca arranged the meeting with remarkable care, but Naomi Brooks almost declined the invitation. The email she received appeared professional, respectful, and unexpectedly brief. Walker Dynamics thanked her for submitting thoughtful operational observations and invited her to visit the company's headquarters for a private conversation regarding her recommendations. Naomi read the message 3 times before convincing herself it was genuine. She assumed they simply wanted clarification about several logistics questions before moving forward. Nothing in the invitation suggested they knew anything about the restaurant or the rainy evening months earlier. On the appointed morning, Naomi arrived wearing a simple navy business suit instead of her familiar restaurant uniform. She carried no expensive briefcase, no impressive credentials, and no expectation beyond answering questions honestly. The receptionist welcomed her warmly before escorting her to a conference room overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Several members of the operations team were already waiting, including Rebecca Collins, whose expression reflected genuine curiosity rather than corporate formality. The discussion began with logistics. Rebecca asked how Naomi had recognized the weaknesses in the expansion schedule using only publicly available information. Naomi answered without hesitation. She explained that large systems often revealed hidden patterns when different industries were studied together instead of separately. Transportation capacity, seasonal weather, manufacturing timing, labor availability, and regional infrastructure rarely failed independently. They influenced one another. Most reports examined only one variable at a time. She preferred studying how every variable interacted across the entire system. The room became noticeably quieter as she spoke. Her explanations were clear without becoming arrogant. She never exaggerated her conclusions. Whenever uncertainty existed, she acknowledged it immediately instead of pretending to possess absolute answers. Ethan Walker listened from the far end of the table without interrupting. He recognized the same disciplined thinking that had impressed him while reading her report. Yet one question continued echoing inside his mind. Finally, after the operational discussion concluded, he looked directly at Naomi. "May I ask you something unrelated to logistics?" Naomi nodded politely. Ethan slid a photograph across the conference table. It showed the private dining room from months earlier, captured before the interrupted surveillance recording. Naomi recognized the restaurant immediately. Her expression remained calm. "Do you remember that evening?" Ethan asked quietly. She smiled with gentle honesty. "Yes, sir. I do. Why did you ask me to wait?" The room fell completely silent. Naomi glanced briefly toward the window before answering. "Because something did not feel right. I noticed 2 guests paying unusual attention to your movements. I asked my manager whether additional security had been scheduled. He believed everything was normal, and he may very well have been correct. I had no proof that anything was wrong. I only knew I would regret staying silent if my concern turned out to matter." Ethan leaned forward. "Why did you never tell anyone afterward?" Naomi answered almost immediately. "Because nothing actually happened. The maintenance team arrived. You left safely. The investigation found no clear evidence of a threat. I had no reason to claim I had accomplished something important when I could not know whether my instincts had changed anything at all." Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment. The simplicity of her answer carried more weight than any speech he had heard inside a boardroom. Rebecca then asked another question that had quietly puzzled everyone present. "Where did you learn operations analysis at this level?" Naomi smiled modestly. "Several years ago, I completed a degree in industrial engineering while working evenings. After graduation, my mother became seriously ill. I postponed my career plans to care for her, and after she recovered, I continued working at the restaurant because it provided the flexibility we needed. I never stopped studying because learning never depended on my job title." No one spoke for several seconds. The executives had expected intelligence. They had not expected humility strong enough to hide extraordinary ability behind ordinary work without resentment. In that moment, Ethan understood that the greatest mistake he had made was never underestimating a waitress. It was believing that remarkable talent always arrived wearing an impressive title instead of quiet character. The meeting ended with a silence that carried more meaning than applause ever could. As the executives slowly gathered their notes, Ethan Walker remained seated, studying the woman he had once dismissed with a single careless sentence. Months earlier, he had seen only a waitress carrying a silver tray. Today, he saw an engineer whose discipline had protected both people and possibilities without asking for recognition. He stood and looked around the conference room before speaking with unusual sincerity. "I owe everyone here an announcement," he said. "But first, I owe Naomi Brooks an apology." Every conversation stopped. Ethan turned toward Naomi instead of addressing the room. "The night we first met, I judged you before learning anything about you. I assumed your uniform defined your abilities. I spoke with arrogance instead of respect. Looking back now, I realize I was not seeing the person standing in front of me. I was only seeing my own assumptions. For that, I am deeply sorry." Naomi accepted his words with the same calm expression she had carried throughout the meeting. She did not appear triumphant. She simply nodded. "Thank you for saying that," she replied softly. "We all make quick judgments sometimes. What matters is whether we are willing to change after we recognize them." Ethan smiled faintly, appreciating that she had offered grace instead of humiliation. Later that afternoon, he requested an all-hands leadership gathering inside the company's largest auditorium. Department heads, managers, engineers, analysts, and administrative staff filled the room, expecting another strategic update about the infrastructure project. Instead, Ethan walked onto the stage carrying only a thin folder. Behind him, the large presentation screen displayed a simple sentence: "Great ideas deserve respect before they earn recognition." The audience exchanged curious glances as Ethan began describing how a series of operational improvements had recently protected one of the company's most ambitious projects. He carefully explained that the breakthrough had not originated inside an executive office or an expensive consulting firm. It had come from someone who had quietly studied public information, recognized hidden patterns, and chosen responsibility over silence. Then he invited Naomi onto the stage. Many employees looked surprised as the young woman in the simple navy suit approached the podium. Ethan continued speaking before anyone could draw conclusions. "Several months ago, I met Naomi under circumstances that revealed more about my character than hers. I failed to recognize extraordinary judgment because I allowed appearances to influence my thinking. Since then, Naomi has helped our company avoid significant operational challenges through careful analysis, humility, and remarkable discipline. She also demonstrated uncommon integrity long before any of us knew her name." The room remained completely still. There was no dramatic music, no celebration orchestrated for effect, only genuine attention. Ethan then did something few executives of his stature ever chose to do. He admitted his mistake publicly without excuses. "Leadership is not measured by how rarely we make mistakes," he said. "It is measured by whether we have the courage to acknowledge them openly and learn from them. Today I am asking every leader in this company, beginning with myself, to judge ideas by their quality instead of the titles attached to them." The audience responded with warm applause that grew steadily louder, not because of corporate protocol, but because honesty often inspires respect more deeply than perfection ever can. Ethan turned toward Naomi one final time. "Walker Dynamics would be honored to offer you a senior strategic operations position if you are interested. Whether you accept or decline, this company will always remain grateful for what you have already done." Naomi looked across the auditorium filled with people she had never expected to address. She thought about long nights in the library, quiet shifts at the restaurant, and the simple belief that doing the right thing never required an audience. For the first time since that rainy evening months earlier, she realized that kindness offered without expectation sometimes returned in ways no one could have predicted, transforming not only careers, but hearts that had finally learned to see beyond appearances. Naomi waited until the applause faded before answering Ethan Walker's offer. She looked across the auditorium at hundreds of employees whose attention rested not on her clothes or her past, but on the quiet moment unfolding before them. Then she smiled with the same warmth that had welcomed strangers into the restaurant every evening. "I am deeply grateful for your generosity," she said. and I would be honored to help solve meaningful problems alongside people who believe good ideas can come from anywhere. But before I accept anything, I would like to ask for one favor. Ethan nodded immediately. Anything within my power. Naomi took a slow breath. Please do not make this story only about me. There are thousands of hardworking people across this country whose talents are hidden behind uniforms, name tags, and jobs that others overlook. Servers, janitors, delivery drivers, receptionists, warehouse workers, caregivers, and countless others often carry extraordinary wisdom that the world never pauses long enough to discover. If this experience has taught us anything, I hope it reminds us to build opportunities for them too. The room became completely silent once again. Naomi continued with quiet confidence. Instead of offering me a signing bonus or a special reward, I would like Walker Dynamics to create a scholarship and professional development program for employees working in restaurants, hotels, retail stores, and other service industries who want to continue their education in engineering, technology, logistics, or business. Give people the chance to be seen before they have to prove they deserve to be seen. Ethan looked toward his executive leadership team before returning his attention to Naomi. Without hesitation, he extended his hand. Done, he said. We will establish the Naomi Brooks Opportunity Scholarship, and it will begin accepting applications this year. Not because you asked for recognition, but because your life reminds us what becomes possible when potential is given a chance. The auditorium erupted into heartfelt applause, stronger than before, because everyone understood they were witnessing something much larger than a corporate announcement. They were watching humility reshape power. Over the following months, Walker Dynamics launched the scholarship program, partnered with community colleges and universities across the United States, and opened mentoring opportunities for workers whose ambitions had too often been ignored. Applications arrived from every corner of the country. Many recipients later admitted that they had nearly abandoned their dreams before discovering that someone who once wore the same uniform believed they deserved another opportunity. Naomi accepted her new role with the company, bringing the same discipline, kindness, and thoughtful curiosity that had guided her through every stage of her journey. She treated interns with the same respect she showed senior executives, remembering that titles could change overnight while character remained the true measure of a person. Ethan changed as well. Employees noticed that he now greeted receptionists by name, thanked custodial staff before leaving the office each evening, and asked thoughtful questions before making assumptions. The transformation was never dramatic. It appeared in small daily choices that slowly reshaped the culture of an entire organization. Years later, visitors walking through the headquarters often paused before a simple plaque displayed near the entrance. It did not mention billion-dollar projects, corporate awards, or record-breaking profits. Instead, it carried a single message that every new employee read on their first day. Respect every person. The next idea that changes your future may come from the voice you almost ignored. Some people believed wealth created greatness. Others believed influence defined success. But those who knew the full story understood something far more valuable. True leadership begins the moment pride gives way to humility. True intelligence shines brightest when it serves others without demanding recognition. And true character is revealed not by the power to command a room, but by the courage to quietly protect another person, expecting nothing in return. That was the lesson a billionaire never expected to learn from a waitress, and it became the legacy neither of them had ever planned to leave behind. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Hidden Table and join a community that believes true character is revealed not by power or status, but by courage, integrity, and kindness. Thank you for watching, and until next time, we will save you a seat at the Hidden Tables.